Natural Podcast, where we explore the depths of holistic health, uncovering the interconnectedness of our emotions, mind, body, and spirit. The podcast is dedicated to individuals who are on a quest to uncover their truth, understanding their genetic and spiritual DNA, and learning how to harness this knowledge to achieve optimal health. But this isn't just another health podcast. Natural Podcast is here to ignite a spark of hope within you, reminding you of your innate potential for greatness. You are pure love, capable of living life to its fullest expression. Are you ready to embark on a transformational journey to achieve optimal health? In today's episode, we have Amy Pickett Williams. Is a psychotherapist with over 25 years of experience specializing in grief and loss. She began her career in oncology and pediatric care, offering support to patients and families facing illness and death. Later, she expanded her focus to address various forms of loss, such as relationship breakdowns and identity shifts. In community, mental health, and her private practice, in 2023, Amy founded The Light Movement, a non-profit organization that has reached nearly 5,000 people throughout donation-based yoga workshops and retreats. The organization's mission is to make somatic healing accessible, helping individuals integrate grief, rediscover purpose, and grow. Welcome to the Natural Podcast, Amy.
Thank you. I'm excited to be a part of it.
I'm so excited to have you here. I've got here that you absolutely love camping in the mountains. Have we done that lately?
Yes, we can. We love camping as a family. So in the mountains, by rivers, by lakes.
Amazing. And have you explored any new mountains ranges recently, or just go to the usual ones?
Mostly go to the usual ones because here in Colorado we have some great big mountains. My guess is in Australia it's a little different.
Yeah, I'm in Colorado. Wow, you would have absolutely amazing views and mountains and just, variety.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes, we're
So
fortunate.
Amy, tell us a little bit about why grief? I know we're going to go straight into it. Tell us a little bit about you. I know you've had your own history with grief with your father and so forth and so many other things, but yeah, tell us a little bit about what your journey has been to kind of get to where Amy is now.
Yeah, so I've obviously worked in the grief field for over 25 years with my heart song, working with families who have experienced the death of a child. But over the years in my private practice, that's definitely morphed into many other areas of loss, including like infertility and loss of health and loss of independence, obviously loss of a home or finances, loss of a relationship, and even loss of self. And so I've always found it very fascinating. I was obviously trained as a talk therapist, but over the years I've started to learn more and more about how we need to work with the body in order to work with and grow from our grief. So I've also a yoga teacher. Over the last several years, I've really started to integrate yoga and somatic work, that mind-body connection, and some people say mind-body spirit or soul connection, in order to work with and grow with their grief. Why the Light Movement was founded was my dad tragically died actually after a camping accident. A few years ago, they were putting away their RV and a gust of wind blew him over and he ended up with a brain bleed. And tragically, after 2 days of life support, he died. And, but during my whole career, he always said, Amy, you should speak to the work you've done in the death and dying and grief and loss. And I always said to him, Dad, I'm a therapist. I'm an introvert. Not my thing, but he always inspired me. He was a very humble attorney, and in the United States, he spoke nationally as a school attorney on preventing child mandated reporting and preventing school violence, which our country really struggles with, and ensuring that youth had safe places to use public bathrooms that identified transgender. So he was known as a gentle giant and very, very humble, even though he was known as an education lawyer. Well, after he died and life began to get back to normal, my husband and I finally were able to go for a nice little trip by ourselves. And we went to these hot springs in New Mexico. And we went for this beautiful, beautiful hike. And on the way up, it was very, very, very steep. And my husband is very much into rock climbing and mountaineering. And I remember commenting to him, this is going to be hard going down. And he's like, we'll be fine. But it happened to be my birthday. And so we went up to this beautiful mica mine. I don't know if you guys have mica in Australia, but it's like shimmering diamonds. It's a different
Yeah,
mineral.
wow.
And it's beautiful. Yeah. And we went there and we climbed a little bit in the mine and decided to go back to go into the hot springs, which was one of our main destinations. And on our way down, there was this very, very steep path, and there was this juniper tree strutting out in the path. And I held onto the juniper tree, being the vegan and the hippie that I am, and I hugged the juniper tree, and I told my husband, this tree has saved many, many people. And my husband said, I'm sure it has. He's not a vegan, he's not a hippie, but he appreciates my spirit. And so we started down the last part of the path. And my husband said, do you want me to lead? And I said, no, it's my birthday. I'm going to lead. And I started down the last steep section, and I tripped and I fell 40 feet. I ended up with 600 cactus spines in my body, a fractured
Wow.
tibia,
No.
and eventually landed. And I should have fallen 100 feet, and I should be dead. But you can only guess what stopped me. You know what it was?
The
It's another
tree?
juniper tree. Another juniper tree.
Wow. Oh my gosh,
Mhm.
goosebumps everywhere. That is insane. It's kind of like because you hugged the first one, the other one looked after you.
Yeah, interconnectedness of life, right?
That is
Yeah. Yeah.
insane.
So we rushed to the hospital. I was terrified I had a brain bleed, how my dad died, and I did not, thank goodness. And that they did a whole bunch of scans, and they said, you know, you're going to be pulling cactus spines out for the rest of your life, or at least for the year. But I thought it was going to be the rest of
Yeah.
my life. And we did. It was about a year pulling them out. And my husband went to get the car for us to go back to Denver because they said you need to get back to Denver because you do have a fractured tibia, but you can drive back. It's not urgent. My husband goes to get the car, and he comes into the waiting room, and I have fully passed out. So my husband now, my sweet, sweet dear husband, has now thought I've died twice in a day. They
Oh my
readmit me into the
gosh.
hospital to ensure I didn't have a belly bleed, and sure enough, I did not have a belly bleed, thank goodness, but I had a mass in my belly. They said, get back to Denver. Get back to Denver as fast as you're able and get this checked out. It turns out I had cancer. So that juniper tree saved my life twice, right?
Wow.
So during my healing, during my recovery, my dad's voice came back to me and said, Amy, this is your time. This is your time to teach about grief, to teach about the mind body based tools that you've learned and taught so many people in your career. And so and September is very significant, and I'll share why in a second. We got a group of volunteers together to do a big event on the winter solstice, December 21st. And offered a somatic workshop, and then we brought faith representatives from as many different religions we could come up with to stand in solidarity for people experiencing grief. Now, that September is significant because we planned this right before the horror of what happened in our world with Gaza and Israel, and obviously many others that were going on during that time, Ukraine. And so the beauty of all this is we were able to bring representatives that were rabbis and Muslim and Buddhist and Christian and Native American, and as many as we could to come together. And it was an amazing event. We had about 500 people watch it virtually all over the world. We had about 200 people in person, and it was amazing. And my dad's voice came to me afterwards and said, you're not done. And so a group of us got together, of the same group with some more, and we formed a nonprofit very recently. And so our goal is, we have 4 goals: to remind people they're not alone in their grief, to teach somatic, mind, body, spirit, or soul-based tools to support integrating their grief and finding purpose, to connect with other resources to support people in their grief, and the 4th, to stand in solidarity for all people and all types of grief or loss, which goes back to what you asked earlier. There's all these areas of loss that I work in, and it's all of us are impacted. It's the one human condition none of us are immune from. We all grieve.
Yes. 100%. Wow, thanks so much for sharing that with us, Amy. I'm sorry to hear about your dad's loss, but at the same time, I feel as if that was such a pivotal shift in your life, and I felt like there was, resistance from you in regards to speaking and in regards to speaking about grief and being out there as a person and being vulnerable. But I guess the catalyst of your dad just kind of pushed for it, and now you've got this beautiful light movement, which is magical.
Hmm. Yes. Yeah. And our goal is globally to reach people through our different offerings.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about the light movement soon, but I wanted to get a bit of information about grief. You've
Yeah.
mentioned, relationship breakdowns. You've mentioned loss. When us humans or people think about grief, the one thing that really stands out is people dying, right? But I'm
Hmm.
pretty sure there's other griefs. Are you able to just talk to us about these a little bit?
Hmm.
One that kind of piqued my interest was self-identity. I think you mentioned. So if we could just
Yeah.
go through a little bit about the type of griefs and then a little bit more about the self-identity one, that would be amazing.
Sure. Yeah. So, part of what light stands for is love and grief. So anytime we have an attachment and we lose that attachment, we can experience grief, right? Especially a significant attachment. So an attachment to our health and we lose our health, there's grief there, right? If we're, our independence and we lose that due to illness or injury, there's loss there. Relationship, there's loss when we're with someone and we lose that person, whether through death or separation or divorce. There's grief there, right? And then obviously that we need financial means to survive. And so when we lose our finances, if we become unemployed or homeless, there's loss there. There's loss for women that are unable to have babies through. I work with a lot of women with infertility. And then going to that loss of self identity, a prime example would be, when parents become parents. It's a beautiful thing in many, many ways, right? But there's also this sense of loss of who was I before? And I grieve that a bit. As much as I love this new child and being a parent of three kids, I can totally relate, right? It's a beautiful thing, but life has changed. There can be, people that are working really, really hard and they decide they're ready to retire. So much excitement. I'm ready to retire. And yet this has been my identity for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And now what? Right? I've been a college student. I've been enjoying school. Life is great. I'm in college and then I did grad school and now I have to find a job. But what happened to my life as a student? Right? I mean, there's so many levels that we experience of loss of self and figuring that out for ourselves and that change.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the key word there. When we have attachment, then there's
Yes.
grief. I've never heard anyone explain grief that way. And it's just so simple. And I was just like, wow, you are so right. When I think back about my own experience, whenever I've had an attachment and there was a loss, there was grief. 100% there was grief. So
Hmm.
is attachment healthy in your eyes? What do you see? What's your views on attachment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's healthy in many, many ways, right? I mean, we have the attachment to ideally our parent or caregiver when we're children, and that helps us develop into healthy human beings. We have attachment to a pet, to a relationship. Those are all very, very important things, right? Sometimes we can have unhealthy attachments, for example, to food or drugs or there is that piece as well. And yes, there's even loss in that. I mean, I don't happen to work with people that struggle with substances. However, I do know that people with substances, there's a lot of grief in that, of knowing that coping mechanism, if they decide to stop, there's some loss in that because it served them well for so long. And I work with children who have parents with that. So I see that in my practice as well. So I mean, attachment is part of life, including animals, right? Animals grieve too. There's an
Yeah,
incredible story, and I wish I could. It's Barbara. I cannot remember her last name. I wish I could. She's a researcher, and she's done a lot of research around loss with animals. And, elephants grieve for long periods of time.
really.
There, hmm there was there's a story of a type of whale who her calf died, and she spent, I believe it was weeks, at least, maybe even months, trying to carry her baby along, even though the baby had died in the ocean. So
Wow.
even reptiles. I mean, there's so much interesting research about that. So, yeah, attachment is, I think, part of our living existence, no matter who we are.
Yeah, wow, what a cool research study to be like, it's not just humans that we grieve, it's also, animals that grieve too. And I mean, I see it
Hmm.
because, I've had a friend who's had two dogs and like one dog passed away and then the other dog was like totally different, like their personality changed for weeks and it's like, wow, that dog
Hmm.
is grieving their friend.
Hmm. That's right. That's right.
It's so
Yeah.
beautiful. And I love your view on attachment that it is healthy. And I guess when grief happens, are there like stages when grief happens, or is it always the same for most people? Is it ebb and flow? Is it and it's got so many questions. And then like the other question that came up is like a lot of people say with grief it takes time to heal. But then I've read something else and he says it's actually the processing that heals it. So is it the processing or is it time? Is it both? What are the stages? Let's go into it.
Yes. Yes. So, stages of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is a person that really came up with that many years ago. And I have a lot of compassion and passion for what she brought to the surface in regards to talking about grief. Her studies, though, were for terminally ill patients. Terminally ill patients, for the most part, went through stages, but the study
Okay.
was not for caregivers, and it was not meant to be. But what happened in popular media is that her stages became the popular. And what we now know is people actually don't go through a set number of stages, right? It's more like this chaos of, at times I'm angry and at times I'm numb and at times I'm in denial. And so it's just a chaos of different experiences. And many different grief experts have many different theories on how to work with loss. The part that's missing in most of the popular theories that are utilized is that it doesn't look at our body. And we actually hold our grief and our trauma in our body. And so if we think of it that way, trying to talk it out or go through stages or the chaos or any of those things, it really does not work the way we would like it to work. And so we have to better understand the science of grief. And the science of grief is that it impacts pretty much every part of our brain, but it also really impacts our body. And the science behind that is Dr. Stephen Porges with polyvagal theory. And so what we recognize is that if we can learn how to work with our grief in our bodies, we can work to grow with our grief. And I think it's important to note that we don't necessarily heal from grief. The grief is always there. But Lois Tonkin, she was a researcher back in the mid 90s, and she only wrote one article, but it's a profound article that's morphed over the years. If you imagine there's three balls and there's three glass jars, what we know is that the grief balls, do not decrease in size, but each jar will continue to get bigger. So the grief will always stay. The scar on that tree will always be there. But if we tend to it and we work with it, I believe somatically, then our tree continues to grow. The scar will always be there, but we will grow from our grief. And so if you think about it that way, how do we do that? Well, the best way to do that is through our body. And the vagus nerve, which is our 10th cranial nerve, which is it's a bidirectional highway. It runs from basically our brainstem down to our lower torso, and it goes both ways. But interestingly, it goes more body to brain. The communication is 80% body to brain versus 20% brain to body. And so if we can
Yeah.
stimulate the vagus nerve, it can help us get back into that place where we can heal. Dr. Siegel came up with something called the window of tolerance years before Dr. Porges. And what we recognize is the window of tolerance is our place where we learn to grow from our experiences. We're in that calm place. We're in that place for yogis. We call it sattva. For scientists like Dr. Porges, we call it ventral vagal. I mean, there's many different forms, but it's where we can function. Our thinking brain's working. Life is okay. It may not be amazing, but life is okay. We can ride the roller coaster in our window, right? But if you think about our window, if I've experienced an intense loss, my window is probably the size of an attic window or the size of a dollhouse window, right? And so I'm going to go outside of that all the time. I'm going to get really amped in that sympathetic state where I'm angry and I'm scared and I'm overwhelmed. Or I'm going to go below the window, what we call the dorsal phase, where it's in that place of dissociation or that place of basically dead to the world, where I'm immobile. I can't function very well either. And in grief, we experience both, right? We experience that intensity, that amped up place. Rajasic is what we call it in the yoga world too. And then we go to that place of, I just don't want to do anything anymore. I can't handle this. I can't handle this horrific breakup I had, or this loss of a family member, right?
Yeah.
And so what part of my work and the work of somatic therapists is to learn how we get back into that window. Stimulating the vagus nerve is one way, which I'll give some tools in a minute. But the other part is, how do we expand our window? So it's not the size of a dollhouse window, but eventually might be the size of a sliding glass door as you go out of patio, right? And so we can ride that roller coaster in a better way. So how we do that is, there's many ways. If we stimulate the vagus nerve, there's many ways to do that. Any breathing exercises can help that, like that longer exhale, breathing in slowly through our nose and slowly out through our mouth, like breathing through a straw. There's vibration, like bee's breath, where we can hum. And that vibration, if you just hum for a minute, if you even want to do it with me, and you put your hand on your neck and just hum, you'll feel your vagus nerve vibrating.
Yes. It vibrates. It full vibrates.
Yeah. What we also know is that different movements can be helpful, even not necessarily connected to the vagus nerve, but anytime we expand. So when we do heart opening, we stretch open, that's that vulnerability of like, I'm ready for people to know my story, what's going on. But in the same breath, we can also close in and say, this is my time to just reflect. But that pendulating helps. That's also part of growing with our grief, that expansion and that contraction. Acupressure, rubbing along our ears, which you can't do because I have my headphones on, but rubbing along your ears, there's these different points, or even just, you don't even have to know the points, but just gently massaging your ears, connect to other cranial nerves, which connect to our vagus nerve. I mean, there's so many beautiful things. If you like to walk, intentional walking is bilateral stimulation. It gets in touch with both sides of the brain, right? If you like to cook, if you like to paint, if you like to write, I mean, all of those things, body-based, can help us, if we're working at it from an intentional standpoint, to grow with our grief. As you can tell, I get super excited about all this.
No, I love it. You're like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have so many questions. But I want to go back to the grief stages, which was really interesting that you mentioned, and I want the audience to just really understand that study done on the grief stages was done for individuals who were ill, not on the caregivers. And usually the individuals that are grieving are usually the caregivers that are spoken about.
Yes.
So it's really interesting that you mentioned that. I think that's a really interesting point. It's like, okay, those are the stages, but like you said, it's all chaotic and it's all at once. It's like, yes, I'm going to be depressed and I'm going to be angry and I'm going to be, and I'm going to accept it. And then all these things, denial and all this stuff is just going to be all mixed up, and it's going to go from one to the other, to the other, to the other, right? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, yeah. And everyone has their own unique journey.
Yeah.
So the loss you've experienced and the loss I've experienced, let's pretend like we've had a serious breakup in our life. And maybe the same type of loss, but we're going to feel it very differently. It could be based on that I've had a lot of losses, so I experience it differently, or you've had a lot of losses. It could be based on our environment. The other part that's so important, too, in how we work with our loss is that ability of social engagement, to connect to another, which is why I love this podcast platform, right? Because it's connection.
Yeah, I've got goosebumps everywhere. Yeah, yes, 100%. So, because when people are grieving, the last thing they want to do is connect to people. But we know cultures, like when I think about my culture from Europe, we know when there's grieving, people go to people's houses, they provide them with food, they sit with them, they hang out with them. And unfortunately, you know, with everyone being so busy and working, a lot of people who are grieving are actually by themselves. Like the image that I got in my head is just someone watching TV, sitting on a couch, or even just laying in bed, not going outside, not feeding themselves good food, not getting community coming in or them going even outside of the house. And that's kind of doesn't really assist with the whole grievance process with what you said about being social.
That's right. That's right. And there's a time and place to withdraw into, right?
Yeah.
But there's
Okay.
also a time and place to hold space for another.
Yeah. And what does that holding space look like?
Well, it can look like a lot of different things. It can look like being present with someone as they just sit there in silence. I mean, there are no words really that can tend to people's grief. It's
And
just
that's the
being
thing,
present.
when someone passes away, or there's grief, it's like, what do the other people do? Like, you know, it's kind of like, do you call them? Do you text them? Do you go to their place? Like, you know, or you can ask them, like, what would you like? Like, what is reasonable to do? Like, what do you do to someone that's grieving as an outsider?
hmm hmm And that question is very, very broad. I mean, the most important thing I say to people is check in. Even if it's, if it, let's say your dear friend lost a significant person in their life, right? You check in with them and you don't forget because a lot of people will stop after a month, maybe two, and then that's it. And so I always say, if you can, that weekly check-in, that monthly check-in for at least 2 years. And ideally, if you can remember the anniversary, especially around death,
Mm,
to say, hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm thinking about you. Because 4 years from now, that person's still going to be thinking about the person that was close to them that died.
yeah, yeah. Like you said, with those cups or those bottles where the grief is still there and the scar on that tree is still there,
Yeah.
and we just learn to move on with it in a way and process it. But I do want to also talk a little bit about the somatic stuff that you mentioned, which I think is just extraordinary. And you gave us some insight of like the humming, which the vibrational was amazing, rubbing of the ears, acupressure points, yoga, even walking, the bilateral, stimulating the vagus turn. It's interesting. How did you come across that? Did you see any? Because you've worked with grief before. Is this a new thing that you've put into your practice and you've seen amazing results? Is it something that you stumbled across? Is it something that you researched? Something that you've experienced?
Yeah, so honestly, the walking has always been that's very, very important to me. Walking with one of our animals, our dog, or dogs, depending on in the class. Um, but I think it's honestly, I started to recognize that missing piece early in my career, and so I started studying it. And there's amazing people out there. I mean, um, three of my mentors are actually volunteering their time for part of our training, and they're the ones that really influenced my work. Dr. Ariel Schwartz, and Joanne Lutz, and Amy Weintraub. And they were influenced by like Dr. Stephen Porges, right? And Dan Siegel, and Deb Dana, all these, people that are very known. And obviously Bessel van der Kolk is another big one. The Body Keeps Score. He was one of those significant pioneers of bringing it out there, saying it's in our bodies. Trauma is in our bodies. Grief is in our bodies, right? So I was influenced by many people that were influenced by many people, but it is a relatively newer field, right? I mean, it's only in the last couple decades that we recognize the importance of why we need to do this work.
Yeah, and there's some absolutely amazing pioneers in the fields, like you've mentioned.
Yes.
It's interesting that, you know, when grief happens or when trauma happens, we store it in our body, right? Um,
hmm
it kind of like, just thinking about it, it's kind of like, that's really interesting. It doesn't really make sense. But with what you said with the vagus nerve, the connection from the brain to the body and the body and the brain, the 80% and the 20%, it's like, wow, now that, you know, even the audience listening knows that, it's like, okay, I can do other things than just the traditional talk therapy for my grief.
That's right. That's right.
And not that we're putting down talk therapy, it has its place and it's beneficial. So what does it look like
Oh yeah, I mean,
combining?
I am a talk therapist too, right? I mean, they both
Yeah,
serve their place. Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. So what would a session look like with grief and somatic and talk therapy? What does that look like?
Yeah, so, a client will come in to see me and, share their story. This might be an initial session or it might be ongoing. And I start to notice what their body is doing as they're telling me their story, right?
Oh, that's
So they may
interesting.
start to get more
Okay.
amped up and anxious, right? They may be like, I can't sleep. I don't know what to do. I can't focus on my job. And their body's starting to jump up and down, right? Or tighten up. And I'll say, it sounds hard. And I will mirror an exhale. I'll just say, which a lot of times will get them to exhale, but not always, right? And then I'll
It
say,
depends
maybe
how
we
amped
could
up
do,
they are.
right, exactly. And so then when a lot of times I'll just get that place of curiosity. I notice that you're hardly breathing right now, or I notice your fists are clenched. Let's talk, can you share with me a little more about what's going on? And so we start there. We start with the sensations, right? Or
Mm.
someone might be hunched up on the couch in my therapy office, arms crossed over chest. And I'll say, it seems like things are, you're pretty closed up today. Can you tell me more about that? And then I might mirror just opening my arms a little bit, right? Just that, putting my arms on the armchair. Sometimes that will help. And it's not always, right? And so we start, and it's really important to know, I listed my three mentors. Amy Weintraub always talks about meeting the mood. So if I have a client that's in that really lethargic dorsal phase, I'm not going to say, hey, let's go for a walk. Because they'd be like, forget you, right? I can barely move, and it's amazing I made it into your office today.
Mm.
So, or vice versa. If I have someone really amped up, I'm not going to say, I think it might be time to do a meditation, right? So you have
Yeah.
to meet the nervous system where it's at in order to be able to support it. So part of my work is trying to figure out what that is and then teaching some tools while also holding space when they need to talk about their story. That's
Yeah.
also important too.
I love that you're able to sit there with them and not just listen to the words that are coming out of their mouth, but you're actually listening to their body. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
amazing as a therapist. And I don't know how many individuals do that. And it's like, wow, okay, so when they talk about this, their fists are clenched. Or when they talk about a
Mm-hmm.
certain thing, their shoulders are just like uptight and they can't move. Or yeah, it's really, really, really interesting. And I think it's beneficial. And then you're like, okay, well, what we can do is let's try and do this. And then then you're using the mirror neurons to get them to kind
Mm-hmm.
of open up, but slowly. And I think that's absolutely magical. And I think there's so much healing that can occur there.
Yes. Yes.
Do you see with grief, do you see individuals being able to, I guess, you said you can never heal from grief, but recover from it in maybe even one session, two sessions? Or do you see people have like more sessions where it's like usually people come to me for 5 or 6 sessions, or usually it takes about 3 to 6 months? Is there an average that you see?
No, because it really depends on the loss, and it also
Yeah.
depends on, some complicated grief, which is where you can have ongoing losses and you can have a trauma component to it. So,
Mm.
everyone is unique and individual. So, I mean, it doesn't, obviously I believe in talk therapy and I believe in somatic therapy, but, for some people, there's not enough therapists out there, at least in our country. That might be true in yours as well. And so there are other ways we can work with this, right? And so, going to a trauma and grief informed yoga class, we happen to offer them. We'll be building our virtual platform, but I'm sure, finding them in Australia. And so complementing the therapy can be really helpful. Encouraging my clients to go for a walk intentionally and noticing the senses around them can be also very, very helpful.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about this yoga.
Yeah. So being a yoga teacher as well, one of our platforms is providing grief and trauma informed yoga. So it's very much accessible to everyone. obviously, and I have people that are in chairs and I have people that are standing and, mobile. But it's learning how to get in touch with the body, gently move the body to hopefully grow from our experiences. And so we offer that. But there's many other somatic classes. We'll be adding more to the light movement, but if you're into dancing, it's a beautiful way to work with your grief. Learning about somatics and then doing some of these things that maybe you've always done can also help with growth.
Yeah, I love that. And, recently myself, I've gone through a bit of grief in the last few months, and it's interesting that I've seen my counselor, and they're a somatic counselor, and it kind of went through what you just spoke about. It was like every time these emotions came up, I just wanted to move. And she was like, "Yep, just move what you need to do." And I started playing footy, which is Australian football. And it was just extraordinary how that sport allowed me to recover from grief and loss. And it had the combination of movement, and it had the combination of social, having support. And I just didn't even think or ever would have thought about how much something as simple as that was able to help me with what was happening in my mind.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Do you see a lot of people using sports as a base to help them with grief?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's body based, right? And some people just need to be educated on it. Like they'll come in and they'll say, well, the one thing that's bringing me joy right now is playing soccer. And I'll say, let's talk about that. Tell me why that brings you joy. And they'll say, well, I feel good afterwards and I'm moving and I love talking to my teammates, social engagement, right? So making that connection, which really is the message of the light movement, is, many people are doing some things, but they don't know why it works. And then when they learn why it works, and then when they learn it, they can integrate more of like, oh, I can do this more when I'm feeling this experience of grief or the emotions that come with grief. Or we get the opposite person of like, I don't know what to do. I don't know anything, but I sure as heck don't want to go talk to a therapist.
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't we try a yoga class? Why don't we try,
There is a lot of people talking about the window of tolerance that we spoke about at the bottom, the disassociation. I guess, although most of those individuals would just be like, I actually don't want to talk about it. Like, I don't want to go there.
Right.
I don't want to talk about it. So you saying maybe go to yoga class without even talking about the grief, that's extraordinary. Yeah. That's a totally different avenue for these individuals that they didn't even think they had.
Yes. Yes. It's beautiful, isn't it? And then the other piece that I think is so important is that at least our model is we do these trainings and people can take our training, right? Our first one's in October, but our hope is that they will then morph it to make it work where they live, in their community, their culture. So for example, if we had someone that took our training that, was a dancer in Africa, and they took it and they said, Amy, this is great, but I need to morph it for what fits here for me. We want them to do that, right? We want them to morph it to fit with what works in their culture.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about this training. What type of training is it? Who can do it? What is the end outcome of it?
Yes, so it's a 20-hour training. We're offering in October. We're going to offer it again in the spring, a little more spread out. But right now it's 2 evenings and 2 weekend days. So in Australia, it might be middle of the night. I'm not sure. You'd have to check. But it's a chance to learn about the science of grief and the somatics of grief and how we can grow with our grief. So in our country, we have continuing ed credits available for psychologists and mental health providers and nurses, but anyone can take our training. And right now we have people signed up that are not professionals in that area, but they have their own grief story. And then we have people that are like, I'm excited to get continuing ed credits. So our hope is to be able to do that in different countries, right? Even Australia, like how do we get credits for mental health providers there? But for right now, we have it in our country. So that's one option. And then obviously we have our classes as well. We are open to definitely offering workshops too, like 2 or 3 hour ones. I love doing those to get in touch with what we're doing here today and bring in some therapeutic art is wonderful as well. We have a grief retreat. If anyone from Australia or anyone that tunes into you wants to come to Colorado in November, but we'll offer that annually. And we're also offering a burnout retreat because so many of us are feeling burned out in our life, and we're doing that in April. And there's a lot of loss and burnout. Like, I thought I was going to do this job forever. I thought I was going to love being a mother forever, and I'm feeling some burnout, right? So, I mean, we all have those different experiences in our, not to say that I don't love my kids desperately, but there's times, even in my own personal experience, I'm like, this is hard and I need a break, right? So, we have many different possibilities and potentials for people, but they're all on our website.
I love that. And I'm going to link that training in the show notes, which is absolutely amazing. So will that training be beneficial for individuals, or is it for individuals to then help others?
Both. We offer a discount to the training for those that want to volunteer for light. So
Okay.
if someone wanted to just take the training for themselves, totally awesome. We have to survive as a nonprofit, so it's great to get some tuition in. We just found out our insurance was going to be $13,000 a year,
Wow.
and we're all
Fun.
volunteers, right? So we need some money coming in for the full amount, but we also really believe in paying it forward and others to pay it forward. And so we offer discounts. So if someone were to say, I want to take this training and I want to help spread light in my country, that those hours would count as volunteer hours. I want to help fundraise. I want to let people know that they can donate to light to keep the mission going. That counts as volunteering. Or I want to offer a class. I'm a dancer. I'm a yoga teacher. I'm an artist. I want to offer a class through Light and let any donations that come in, all our classes are donation based, so you don't have to pay, can come into Light. So there's many ways to pay it forward.
That is amazing. So you've created a platform where someone's grieving and they can come and attend these classes. I'm guessing like a yoga class. What other classes are available?
Right now, we have a yoga class that's virtual and in person, but in the next month, we'll have about 4 or 5 more. We have a sketching class. That one's not virtual right now, but we may try to make it virtual in the future. But our hope is these we call it pockets of light, right? So maybe in us in Melbourne, where you are, maybe we'll have someone that will say, I want to offer something through Light, and then we can put it on our website, but then people in Australia will say, oh, I live in Melbourne. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. I know we were teasing about accents earlier.
No, I love it. I love it.
Melbourne.
For any of the
Melbourne.
Australians, she's talking about Melbourne.
So that might be a place, right? Someone could say, oh my gosh, I want to do this here. And we can email back and forth, and they can, ideally, we could maybe set it up. And then eventually, pockets of light, we want to put them on our website, but we want to, let's say someone does a volunteer training or does a training and they volunteer and then they say, I want to continue this, but in my own business. It's just cool to know that we started something.
Yeah, and I think it's extraordinary for individuals who are going through grief or caregivers that know someone who's going through grief
Yes.
to have this as an option. Because when I was going through what I was going through, that didn't even cross my mind. I mean, I wouldn't have researched it. I would have wanted the individuals that were around me, I guess, to maybe mention it. And I would have been like, wow, what is this? This is amazing. Because I remember when I was going through something, I was like, wow, how can I function through daily life? I just felt like they should be, and this is what went through my head, is like, the government should provide at least 6 weeks of pay for individuals who are grieving, so they are able to not even think about anything and just focus on getting better. Because when you're going through grieving, you have to take time off work, finances, you have to look after yourself, or you have to work, and then you're not providing the best quality to your employer or to yourself if you have your business. And I was like, what an amazing idea would it be if, the government or some type of organization was able to give, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever it is, payments for people who are grieving.
Yes. Yes. That's right.
So the Light platform is something that can kind of provide that, not financial, but provide another form of support that people are able to assist them to, recover from grief. So I think what you're doing is just absolutely amazing. And I think more people need to know about that. And that's why I'm so excited to share the light movement here on the Natural Health Podcast, so more individuals are enlightened and understand that they don't have to grieve alone.
No, they don't. And they can do our classes. We'll have also a platform of recordings as well. I'm sure we'll record our training too, for people, but they don't have to do it alone. And again, our true hope from that social justice model is people will learn about light and then say, you know what, I could do this. I'm actually a hiker. I could lead a group and then let people hike.
Imagine that. Imagine that being able to join a hiking, walking, photography class, whatever class, art class, and all the individuals are going through some type of grief themselves, and they are provided with a safe space to just be.
Yes, that's our hope. Yes.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Absolutely love it. And if anyone is listening to the podcast and, has something to offer, think about it. I think it's just magical to be able to give your time and assist individuals who are going through this rough time. Like you said at the start of the podcast, it's something that we all go through. We literally all go through it.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amy, someone who might be going through grief right now, or, in the short term, so something acute that's happened right now, what could be one of the first things that could be done in the first few days of that grief? Is there anything that, from your research or from your experience, that is a game changer?
Yeah, I think number one is recognizing that whatever you're feeling is normal, right? Any feeling we have is normal. And it's also important to note that sometimes we have really intense, dark feelings that can be very, very normal. And that's when you need to reach out for sure for support. Many, many people I've worked with who have experienced the death of a partner say, I just want to be with my partner now. Totally normal. And if you're starting to have those thoughts of like, I'm going to do that to be with my partner, you need to reach out for help. Ideally, we reach out for help anyway and to find other connections with people. But that normalization is so important. The other part that's so important is that there's Dr. Jill Bolt-Taylor talked about the 90-second rule. Anytime we have an intense emotion experienced in grief or anything really, if we allow ourselves to feel it, it will dissipate. It's not to say that it won't come back, but there's tsunami waves, and in between the waves of each wave, Viktor Frankl spoke about this, and he was a survivor of the Holocaust. Between the stimulus and the response is where we find our freedom and our growth. So knowing that between each wave, we can have that pause of saying, I'm gonna grow from this as hard as it is, and I'm gonna work with it. And so that would be my little bit tidbit I'd give for someone that's experiencing an intense loss right now. Allow yourself to feel it, and it will dissipate. It will come back, but you will have pauses in those tsunami waves.
Yeah, and I guess, thanks for sharing that. It's beautiful. And I guess the pauses will get longer and longer the more time goes on.
Yes. Yes, just like the ocean.
It's so beautiful. And I think putting on a timer, that's a really good little technique that you can do whenever you're feeling something. Grabbing a phone and be like, I want to put a timer on, and letting the time go past and just, I guess, feeling it, letting it be, and not judging yourself for it and accepting it as normal. And then once it hits 90 seconds, you're like, okay, how am I feeling now? Where am I feeling it? What is it like?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything, Amy, that you want to say before we close off the Natural Health Podcast for today?
I'm just so honored to be a part of it. Our goal is to really spread the light, and you helping us with that is so meaningful and very heart-sung, and I just want to give my gratitude to you for that.
No, I really appreciate it, and I loved having you on here. I loved you sharing information about grief, the tolerance window, the grief theory, all things, what we can do, somatic healing, movement. You've just enlightened us so much about grief and also the light movement. Thank you so much for joining us on the Natural Health Podcast, and remember, you're pure love, capable of living life to its fullest expression.
content and information provided here is the opinion of Mahela Ragoose and is for information purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. It is not intended to provide medical advice or take the place of medical advice or any current treatment you're undertaking. Consult your own medical professionals for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the Natural Health Podcast. It is advised that you consult your doctor or healthcare professional in relation to any health concerns you may be having. Mahela Ragoose does not take responsibility for any health consequences which occur from a person listening, viewing, or reading this content. Under no circumstances shall the Natural Health Podcast, Mahela Ragoose, any guests or contributors to the Natural Health Podcast, or any employees, associates, or affiliates of Mahela Ragoose be responsible for damages arising from the information provided on the Natural Health Podcast. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical conditions in either yourself or others. Please note, if you're taking prescription, do not stop your medication or start a new protocol, including but not limited to supplements, diet, lifestyle changes without consulting your doctor or healthcare professional. If you or any person has a medical concern, you should consult with your healthcare provider or seek other professional medical advice. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something that you have read or heard on the Natural Health Podcast or in any linked materials. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. Neither Mahela Ragoose nor the publisher of this content takes responsibility for the possible health consequences of any person or persons reading or listening or following the information in the educational content.